Today I will be discussing the core programming principles that you should be following to maximize the amount of muscle growth and gains as a result that you get out of your gym sessions. If you're not implementing programming principles like these into your workouts, then it is going to be much harder to progress, since a lot of these are grounded in science and exercise sport science. We will start by discussing progressive overload, and then from there get into things like volume, intensity, frequency, how many times a week should you be lifting, what your individual training split should look like. And then towards the end, we'll even discuss things like periodization and how to structure a training program over the course of months or even a year in totality. So I think that this is an extremely important video if you want to take your training to the next level and see the results that you may have always wanted. So let's start with progressive overload, which is essentially just becoming better over time with your training. For instance, you could progress by increasing the sets over a certain time period, or progressing the reps, or progressing the weight. You could even do things like shorter rest periods in between sets, which ultimately will result in more efficient training over time as well. So in any frame where you become better, that is defined as progressive overload. What I like to do is I like to slowly increase my sets or my reps, because those are fundamental things that are easy to implement over time. For instance, if I'm doing a chest press, one week I may do 3 sets of 10, but the next week I'll bump it up to 4 sets of 10 or something like that. So it's any increment over time where you are improving. Now, perhaps the leading factor in determining how much muscle mass you put on over a given time frame is actually the total amount of volume that you're doing per week. Volume in this context is defined as sets times reps times weight. So it's basically the total amount of work that you're doing over the course of a given time frame, for instance, a week. So the research really points to, on the bottom end of putting on muscle, it would be 10 sets per week per body part, and on the upper threshold, around 25 sets per week per body part. So take chest, for example. If you are trying to hit 10 sets, you might do on Monday 3 sets of bench press, and then 2 sets of flies, and then on Thursday 3 sets of incline dumbbell bench press, and then 2 sets of machine flies, for a total weekly volume of 10 sets per week. Now, that's just the minimum threshold. If you want to really get more serious, then you might want to consider adding in another exercise on each of those days, or adding or increasing the sets and reps over time to increase the total amount of volume that you're doing. Frequency as it pertains to resistance training is the amount of times you hit a given body part per week. So for instance, if you hit chest on Monday and then chest on Thursday, that would be a frequency of 2 times per week. Now, the research points to between 2 and 3 times per week as being the ideal frequency for any given body part. This is due to the fact that if you are hitting a body part only once per week, for example, it only takes between 2 and 3 days for your muscles to fully recover on average. So why would you hit a body part, let's say chest on Monday, and then wait until the following Monday? That will leave between like 3 and 5 days where your chest is just doing nothing. It's just over resting. Whereas it could have been hit sooner, as soon as Wednesday or Thursday, and then reinitiated that protein synthesis signal and gotten back to recovering and becoming better over time. On the flip side, if you're doing more frequency, let's say upwards of 6 times a week, that doesn't really give any given body part enough time to recover. That's only 24 hours between each session. Now, unless you're only doing 1 or 2 sets per session, it's going to be very difficult to recover. And the bottom line is that you just don't know if you're fully recovered. I think it's better to be safe rather than sorry. So, in my personal opinion, I would stick to the frequency of 2 or 3 times per body part, unless you really know your body and you've been doing it for a while. That would be the only circumstance in which I would say get after it. Now, in terms of the total amount of gym sessions that you should be performing in a given week, the answer can vary depending on your goals. If you just want to get a little bit of gains, or you don't want to be that serious yet, you can work out as little as 1 or 2 times per week, as long as the other parameters are put into place, like frequency and volume. This would likely mean that you are doing full body workouts and you are doing a ton of volume in each given session. But in all honesty, if you want to maximize muscle growth, you should be doing at least 5 workouts per week and upwards of 6, maybe 7 if you really play your cards right. But I believe that between 5 and 6 is the sweet spot, because that keeps your sessions fairly short, and therefore you can put more intensity into each set in a given workout, while also maintaining the level of volume that you would want and the level of frequency that you are going to want per week. Now that brings me to the topic of training splits. Your training splits ultimately are a determinant on how many days per week you can and should work out. So, for example, if you can only do 3 times a week, or you'd only like to do 3 times a week, it is probably best to do 3 full body sessions, for example, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If you can do 4 times a week, in order to hit the volume and frequency thresholds that I previously mentioned, you would likely want to do upper body Monday, lower body Tuesday, Wednesday's a rest day, upper body Thursday, lower body Friday, for example. If you can do 5 days, you have a little bit more to play around with. If you can do 6, you probably would want to do a push-pull legs. That's push day Monday, pull day Tuesday, leg day Wednesday, rinse and repeat. Sunday is an off day. Now, these are all just standard guidelines that I'm presenting to you. You can really play around with this as long as you are hitting the previously mentioned principles. But I would like to caution you that certain muscle groups work synergistically together. For example, on any compound lift, you are working more than just one muscle group. For example, on bench press, you are working your pectoralis muscles plus your tricep musculature and your front deltoid musculature. That's 3 different muscle groups all in one movement. And therefore, when you are constructing your programming split, it's important to put certain muscle groups together so that they are not fatigued on further days. For example, if you are working out your chest, you would want to throw in your tricep work and your deltoid work normally. Now, you don't have to do this, but these are just good guidelines to follow when constructing your own training split. For instance, if you are going to be doing a lot of pulling or back work, that is also going to be engaging your biceps, so it may be a good idea to throw on bicep work that day, or at least keep in mind that your biceps are being worked and therefore fatigued. So you might not want to do biceps the following day, at least not in a large quantity. Next, I will be discussing exercise selection, which is essentially which exercises you are choosing to perform in a given exercise bout. Now, I don't like to discriminate against certain exercises. I believe that every exercise can and should have its place in any given exercise routine or program, but in the context of putting on muscle and size, there are certain factors that you want each of your exercises to meet in order to make it in your program. For example, I think that stability is extremely important in determining if an exercise is adequate for building muscle. For example, if you are doing a bent over barbell row, this exercise does not simulate stability that well because you are having to stabilize yourself in space using your core. Now, your core will definitely be a limiting factor in how much you can pull per set. For instance, if you replace this with a chest supported T-bar row, that takes the core being the limiting factor out of the movement and allows you to fatigue your back as much as you possibly can. So that stability aside, another factor which I look for in picking exercises is how fatigable an exercise can be. In other words, can you take the exercise to or near failure in a given set? For instance, if you are doing a barbell bench press, you are going to require a spotter to go all the way to failure. I mean, you could just try, but that's not very safe in the long run. But compare that to a dumbbell bench press. When you're doing a dumbbell bench press, you can go all the way to failure and then just bail on the dumbbells if you need to. Therefore, it can take you through a lot more mechanical tension and result in a lot more growth. My overall two most important checklists for an exercise to be of the muscle building variety is number one, stability, and number two, how fatigable the exercise can be. So as long as those exercises are meeting those two checklists, then I believe that it is probably adequate for building muscle. Now, another thing to keep in mind is you don't want too many exercises per session. I like to stick between 2 or 3 exercises per body part per session so that you have a good amount of variety in the exercises, but you are not overdoing it or underdoing it. For instance, if I'm doing chest, like I've previously mentioned, I would probably do a horizontal press and then couple that with a fly variation or maybe another dumbbell or machine press variation, just to add in some variety and more stimulation for growth. Next, I'd like to just briefly touch on intensity, which is basically how hard you're going in any given set. You should be going at least close to failure or to failure. There's a common way to measure intensity called RIR, which is reps in reserve. As long as you have 3 or less reps in reserve by the end of your set, then you were probably doing it right. You can also measure intensity through RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion. It's basically just a 0 through 10 scale where you are going to rate how intensely your output was for any given set. And lastly, you could also use a percentage of your 1 rep max for an exercise to determine your intensity levels. Now, I'd like you to keep in mind that you shouldn't be going extremely intensely in every single working set over the course of the week because volume and intensity are inversely related. If you are doing a ton of volume, then you can't sustain that intensity for too long before burning out. Same goes for intensity. If you are doing a high amount of output in each set, then it will be hard to reach the adequate volume numbers that you need to grow. So keep your intensity in line, but don't underdo it. Make sure that you are at least going close to failure, but not going too hard. Lastly, I'd like to briefly hit on periodization, which is essentially how you are structuring your training over the course of weeks to months to even years in some cases. Now, I'd like to highlight that this is basically just a way to avoid plateaus in the gym that are caused by doing the same thing over and over and your body ultimately reaching homeostasis. It is basically a way to continuously make progress over a structured period of time. I'd also like to stress that I wouldn't get too much into the weeds about periodization until you probably have at least a year of lifting experience under your belt. In the beginning, periodization is not as important since your body is really latching on to every set and rep that you're doing, because training is ultimately still a novel stimulus to your body. In conclusion, we talked about things like progressive overload, volume, intensity, training frequency, how many days you should be working out, what a given split should look like, exercise selection, and even a little bit on periodization. Now, these are all fine and dandy and very important for to bring your training to the next level, but don't get too stuck up on these training principles until you are having fun in the gym and you are consistent with your training, because those are ultimately the two most important factors for you to be sticking to this long term. And I want to stress that lifting and seeing results on your fitness journey takes time. You really need to learn to enjoy and love the process if you are going to embark on it and see the results that you want. So really just learn to enjoy the process, incorporate it into your identity, make a habit out of it, and just see where it goes before you really get caught up in all of these training principles. Make sure you're going to the gym. Make sure you're having fun.